September 1944. The residents of London had grown accustomed to the rhythmic, pulse-jet stutter of the WWII flying bomb. They knew that as long as they could hear the engine, they were safe, and it was only when the silence fell that the terror truly began. But on the evening of September 8, the rules of warfare changed forever without a single sound of warning. A massive explosion ripped through the district of Chiswick, followed seconds later by a strange, double crack echoing through the atmosphere. There had been no sirens, no spotting reports, and no drone of an approaching aircraft. For the first time in human history, a city was being struck by an object traveling faster than the speed of sound, falling from the edge of space itself. This was the A4, better known to the world as the WWII rocket. It was a technological marvel that seemed to have arrived decades ahead of its time, a sleek, liquid-fueled predator that rendered every existing defense system obsolete. Yet, beneath the polished fins and the revolutionary guidance systems lay a story of staggering strategic delusion and systemic moral collapse. To understand the WWII, one must look toward the isolated, windswept marshes of Peenemünde on the Baltic coast. Here, the brightest minds of German engineering, led by the charismatic and relentlessly ambitious Wernher von Braun, were given a blank check to turn the dreams of science fiction into the reality of modern ballistics. They were not merely building a weapon, they were attempting to conquer the heavens using the bottomless coffers of a regime obsessed with technological salvation. The irony of the WWII program is perhaps the most profound of the entire Second World War. It was a project that cost more than the Manhattan Project, drained the Third Reich of its most precious high-tech resources, and diverted thousands of engineers from projects that might have actually impacted the outcome of the war. In the cold calculus of attrition, the WWII was a weapon that cost more to build than the damage it could ever hope to inflict. While the Tiger tanks were running out of fuel and the Luftwaffe was being swept from the skies, the Nazi leadership remained fixated on this silver bullet. Hitler, a man who favored the grand and the theatrical over the practical, saw in the rocket a way to bypass the Royal Air Force and strike at the heart of the British Empire with impunity. It was a weapon of vengeance, born from the frustration of a losing gambler betting his last chips on a single, impossible hand. But the cost of this ambition was not just measured in Reichsmarks or engineering hours. Behind the sleek curves of the rocket lay the horrific reality of the Mittelwerk tunnels and the Dora Nordhausen concentration camp. It is a haunting historical truth that more people died manufacturing the WWII rocket than were killed by its impact in London, Antwerp, or any other target. The production line was a subterranean hellscape where the pinnacle of 20th-century technology met the depths of medieval cruelty. Slave laborious, skeletal and overworked, assembled the delicate oxygen valves and combustion chambers under the watchful eyes of the SS. The WWII was a machine built by the dying to kill the unsuspecting, a paradox of human ingenuity and inhuman depravity that defined the terminal insanity of the Nazi state. The internal politics of the Third Reich acted as a corrosive acid, eating away at the very efficiency the regime claimed to embody. As the WWII moved from prototype to mass production, a vicious power struggle erupted between the traditional Wehrmacht and the rising shadow of the SS. Heinrich Himmler, sensing the rocket's potential as a tool for personal leverage, sought to wrestle control of the program away from the army's professional engineers. This was not a pursuit of military excellence, but a cannibalistic grab for power that further fractured an already crumbling command structure. The logistical cost of the rocket was a burden that the German economy simply could not bear. To fuel the WWII, the regime required massive quantities of ethyl alcohol, derived from the fermentation of potatoes. In a nation where food rations were plummeting and the population was beginning to starve, the sight of trainloads of potatoes being diverted to fuel plants was a grim testament to the regime's priorities. They were quite literally burning the food of the people to launch a weapon that, in the grand scheme of the war, was little more than a high-tech nuisance. Perhaps the most biting irony of the WWII's deployment was the invisible war fought by British intelligence. Through the double-cross system, the Allies had successfully turned every single German spy in the United Kingdom. When the rockets began to fall, the British fed the Germans false reports regarding the impact points, claiming the missiles were overshooting London. Trusting their intelligence, the German technicians adjusted the rocket's guidance systems, causing subsequent launches to fall harmlessly in the marshes and fields of Kent. The most sophisticated guidance system in the world had been defeated by a few lines of clever fiction. This structural failure extended to the very philosophy of the weapon and APO's design. The WWII was a masterpiece of complexity, requiring thousands of man-hours and specialized parts that were increasingly rare as the Allied bombing campaign intensified. While the Americans were perfecting the assembly line for the B-29 and the Soviets were churning out Tu-34 tanks like clockwork, the Germans were handcrafting temperamental rockets in underground caves. It was a pursuit of quality that ignored the brutal reality of a war won by quantity. Even the brilliant minds at Peenemünde were trapped in a cycle of self-delusion. Wernher von Braun, often portrayed as a man with his eyes on the stars and his feet on the ground, was fully aware of the human cost required to realize his vision. He walked the tunnels of Mittelwerk, passing the piles of bodies of those who had died to build his dream. The technical challenges were solved by the brightest, but the labor was provided by the broken. This disconnect between the soaring aspirations of the scientists and the gutter reality of their patrons defined the systemic moral collapse of the entire enterprise. As the Allied armies closed in from both the east and the west, the WWII program became a frantic race against time, not for victory, but for survival. The German leadership began to realize that the rocket was no longer a weapon of war, but a bargaining chip for the peace that would inevitably follow. The engineers who had spent years perfecting a weapon of mass death were now preparing their resumes for the very enemies they had been trying to destroy. The transition from Nazi and wonder weapon and to the foundational technology of the Cold War was already beginning in the minds of the men who built it. Consider the math of the miracle. The WWII program cost Nazi Germany roughly $2 billion in 1940s currency, a sum remarkably similar to what the United States spent on the Manhattan Project. Yet, while the American investment produced a weapon that fundamentally altered the course of history, the German investment produced a weapon that could barely influence a single tactical engagement. For every rocket that successfully struck a target, thousands of tons of fuel, steel, and liquid oxygen were consumed that could have fueled hundreds of interceptor aircraft. The Third Reich was effectively bleeding itself dry to throw expensive, unguided stones at a wall they could not knock down. This resource drain was compounded by the absurdity of the delivery system. On paper, the WWII was a mobile marvel, launched from a convoy of specialized vehicles known as the Mittelwerk. In practice, these convoys were logistical nightmares, frequently bogged down in the deteriorating infrastructure of a crumbling empire. While the rocket represented the 21st century, the horses that often pulled the transport trailers represented the 19th. It was a collision of eras that perfectly illustrated the fractured state of German industry in the final years of the conflict. Beneath the surface of this technical prowess lay a hidden war of internal sabotage. At the Mittelwerk factory, the enslaved laborers of the Dora concentration camp engaged in a quiet, desperate resistance. They knew that every rocket they completed was intended to kill civilians in London or Antwerp. In response, some prisoners would urinate on the delicate electrical components or intentionally loosen the screws in the guidance computers. These small acts of defiance meant that many rockets failed immediately upon ignition, exploding on the launch pad and killing the German crews instead of their intended targets. This internal friction was mirrored at the highest levels of the Nazi hierarchy. The WWII program became a political football between the Wehrmacht and the SS. Heinrich Himmler, sensing the end was near, sought to seize control of the project to bolster his own power base. He arrested the lead scientists, including von Braun himself, on charges of defeatism and sabotage. The very men who were the Reich's last hope for a technical miracle were thrown into Gestapo cells because they dared to dream of space travel instead of total destruction. The system was eating its own creators. The irony deepened when one examines the strategic impact of the weapon. The WWII was a weapon of terror designed to break the will of the British people. However, unlike the Blitz of 1940, the WWII strikes were silent and unpredictable. There was no siren, no warning, and no defense. To the British public, the explosions were often initially attributed to gas main leaks rather than enemy action. The German High Command believed they were shattering morale, but for a long time, the victims didn't and appos even know they were under attack by a rocket from the edge of space. As the red tide of the Soviet Union moved toward the Baltic coast, the scientists at Peenemünde faced a grim realization. Their sanctuary was no longer safe. The WWII was no longer a secret weapon, but a target for every Allied bomber and every advancing infantry squad. The masterminds of the program began to hoard documents and bury blueprints in abandoned mineshafts. They were no longer working for the Reich, they were curating a portfolio for their future employers. The era of Operation Paperclip was being born in the mud and the blood of a dying regime. The structural failure of the WWII was not just a matter of physics or logistics, but of vision. The German leadership viewed the rocket as a vengeful hammer, a way to punish an enemy they could no longer defeat in the field. But in their obsession with vengeance, they overlooked the true power of what they had built. They had conquered the atmosphere, yet they remained shackled to a medieval ideology of conquest and cruelty. The rocket could reach the stars, but the men who built it were still crawling in the dirt of their own making. While the rockets climbed into the stratosphere, the ground beneath them was saturated with a cost that defies military logic. The WWII program was a financial black hole, consuming nearly 2 billion Reichsmarks, a sum comparable to the American investment in the atomic bomb. Yet, while the Manhattan Project produced a weapon that could end a war with a single strike, the WWII was little more than a high-tech nuisance. It was a masterpiece of engineering that lacked a payload capable of justifying its existence. The most haunting irony of the program lay in the ratio of life to death. Historically, it is estimated that more people died manufacturing the WWII than were killed by its impact on the ground. Deep within the limestone tunnels of the Kohnstein Mountain, the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp became the dark heart of the production line. Thousands of slave laborers, starved and worked to the point of collapse, assembled the most advanced machinery on Earth in conditions of medieval depravity. The rocket was a product of the future built by the ghosts of the past. This systemic disconnect extended to the very infrastructure of the Reich. As Allied bombers systematically dismantled the German synthetic fuel industry and transportation networks, the WWII program continued to demand vast quantities of liquid oxygen and alcohol. To fuel a single launch, the state had to divert tons of potatoes that could have fed a starving civilian population. The leadership was literally burning the food of their people to hurl expensive, inaccurate metal at a city they could no longer hope to conquer. It was a policy of national suicide disguised as technological supremacy. As the front lines collapsed, the scientists at Peenemünde began to see themselves as the ultimate prize of the coming peace. Wernher von Braun and his inner circle knew that their expertise was the only currency that would matter in a post-Nazi world. They were no longer loyal to the swastika, nor were they particularly concerned with the Allied cause. They were loyal to the physics of the vacuum. In the final months, the WWII program transitioned from a military operation into a frantic marketing campaign aimed at the United States. The Americans, through the evolving intelligence network of the Office of Strategic Services, were beginning to realize that the real wealth of Germany was not in its gold reserves, but in its grey matter. The race was on to secure the WWII blueprints and the men who understood them before the Red Army could reach the Baltic. This was a silent war within a war, where the moral crimes of the scientists were weighed against their potential utility in a future conflict with the Soviet Union. The blood on their hands was ignored in favor of the stars in their eyes. Deep in the Harz Mountains, the SS guards at Mittelwerk received orders to execute the scientists to prevent their knowledge from falling into enemy hands. The very men who had been the darlings of the regime were now viewed as liabilities to be liquidated. The scientists, sensing the tightening noose, began a desperate game of hide-and-seek with their own protectors. They hid in mountain hotels and disguised themselves as common soldiers, waiting for the Americans to find them before the Gestapo could finish them. The creators of the most terrifying weapon in history were now the most hunted men in the collapsing Reich.